Nirasya sarva sandeham akikritya sudarshanam prakashita rahasyam tam bhajami gurumishwaram. Shri Govinda Pararavinda Marupananya Vilasho Jitan Purna Prema Rasotsavo Jalamano Vritti Prasannananan Shashvad Krishna Katha Mahamrita Payo Rasho Muda Kelito Bande Bhagavatani Mananulavam Murdna Nipatyakshito Namo Mahavaranyaya Krishna Prema Pridayate Krishnaya Krishna Chaitanya Namne Gaura Tvishe Nama Jayatam Surato Pangor Mama Mandamate Gati Matsarvasva Parambojo Radha Madana Mohano Kuladi Devatamar Madana Mohan Jar Sevak Raghunatha Rup Sanatan Jaya Rupa Sanatana Bhatta Raghunath Shri Jiva Gopala Bhatta Dasa Raghunath Echai Goshai Kori Charana Vandan Jaha Hoite Vignanasha Bhishta Puran Krishna Dasa Kaviraja Rasika Bhakta Maj Jai Rachilo Caitanya-caritamrta Gaura Govinda Lila Shunite Galai Shila Tahate Nahoilo Morachita Jeva Nahi Buji Keva Shunite Shunite Seha Kiad Bhuta Caitanya-carit Krishna upajibe priti janibe raserariti shuni le borohoihit Shriyatam shriyatam nityam giyatam giyatam mura Chintyatam chintyatam bhaktash Caitanya-caritamrta. By the grace of Shri Kali Yuga Pavana, the Svabhajana Vibhajana, Prayojana Avatar, Prema Purushottam, Karuna Mahasagar, Shri Gauranga Mahaprabhu, and his beloved Parshad, the crest jewel of followers of Sri Rupa Gosvami and Sri Raghunath Das Gosvami, Sri Krishna Das Kaviraja Gosvami. Again, today we will absorb ourselves in Sri Caitanya-caritamrta. So we resume Sanatana Shiksha, Madhya Lila, chapter 22. We're in discussion of the Abhideya Tattva, specifically discussion of the adhikar for the principal Abhideya of the Shastra, namely Krishna Bhakti, and that adhikar, or that eligibility, is Shraddha. So in our last discussion, we covered how the term Shraddha is glossed here in the text, as well as a precedent for the concept that it was explained to convey from the Bhagavatam, as watering the root of a tree nourishes the whole tree, as nourishing the pranas nourishes all of the senses, so worshipping Achyuta satisfies all. By worshipping Achyuta, all responsibilities, all duties, etc. are accomplished. Therefore, one who worships Achyuta need not engage in or bear in full the responsibilities of those who follow the karma marg. So to have conviction in this, that one no longer is required to follow the duties incumbent upon someone following the karma marg, by virtue of having conviction in bhakti to Bhagavan, that person is said to have Shraddha. So today we'll look at the gradation in this Shraddha, or in other words, how Shraddha was defined. Shraddha Shabde Bishas Kohe Sudridha Nishchoy, that this firm conviction, Sudridha. Dridha means something firm, or which holds. So sudrida means what is holding something very firm. So very firm conviction of this type was defined as shraddha. But now we'll see that that is shraddha ideally, and that not everyone's shraddha is so firm, nor is it so easy to have such firm shraddha. So what is it that creates a relative firmness or lack of firmness in one's shraddha? That's what we'll examine today. So we'll pick up from Payar 65. So, in the following Payar, the specific characteristics of an advanced bearer of eligibility or an uttamadikari for bhakti are explained. So, as we finished off last time, Shraddha Nusare Shraddha Shraddhavan Jan Hoy Bhakti Adhikari, the person who has Shraddha is a bearer of eligibility for Bhakti. Uttama Madhyama Kanishta Shraddha Anusari, and they're either an advanced bearer of eligibility, an intermediate, or a beginner, or a neophyte, according to that level of their Shraddha. So what is it that makes one advanced? Or what is this advanced state of eligibility? That's what we'll look at now. So he says, Shastra Yuktye Sunipuna Dridha Shraddha Jar Uttamadikari Se Taraye Sangsar. One who has firm Shraddha and is greatly expert in Shastra and reasoning, Yukti, is an advanced bearer of eligibility, or Uttama Adhikari, and delivers samsara. So it doesn't just say that he transcends samsara, that he crosses over samsara, but rather that he delivers samsara, meaning someone who has shraddha of this type is so certain to cross over samsara that they can also cause others to do so, or they're so much not subject to being confined within samsara that they have even the ability to help others cross beyond samsara as well. So this is very high praise, or in other words, someone who has completely firm shraddha is not a common person, or if someone is considered to have this, not only are they certain to cross over samsara, but they're capable even of doing that to others. And as we may experience, that's not such an easy thing to accomplish. So we can understand the rarity of this. So I say that in order to hint at the idea that we ought not assume our shraddha is more firm than it is. In other words, we may have heard many of these ideas 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times. We may be able to repeat them from memory and impress other people with our erudition related to them. But that doesn't necessarily mean we really have shraddha in them. So let's look at what it really means to have shraddha. So I have a few comments here which just introduce the next few verses in the text. So the following verse from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu is cited to evidence the characteristics of an advanced bearer of eligibility that are stated in the present payar. The two payars that follow this evidential verse are similarly descriptions of the characteristics of an intermediate and neophyte bearer of eligibility, and are followed by citations from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu to evidence them. In regard to all three of these payars, excerpts from Sri Jiva Pad's commentaries on these evidential verses from Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu are cited in the tippani. Because all of Sri Jiva Pad's explanations are presented in full in the forthcoming commentaries, no separate citation of the passages excerpted from them in the tippani is made here or following the two forthcoming payars. In other words, in this commentary that's attributed to Chakravarti Pad, he excerpts parts of Jiva Goswami's commentary which explain the verses. I'm just going to present Jiva Goswami's commentaries in full, therefore it's not necessary to discuss both. And this topic of Shastra and Yukti is a big topic, so it's not something it was way too much to include just in commentaries in this section. So later on, I'll also have a separate article in the introduction to this publication which will discuss these topics in greater length with reference to many points made by Jiva Gosvami in the Sarvasang Vadani. But for today, we'll stick to just how Jiva Gosvami comments on these verses in the Sindhu. So the first is as follows. Shastre yukto chanipuna sarvata dridhanishchaya prodha shraddho dikariya sabhaktavutamo mata. One who is expert in Shastra and reasoning is of firm resolve in all respects, and has intense Shraddha, is to be considered an advanced bearer of eligibility. Sri Jiva explains the meaning of this definition as follows in his commentary. So, quote, on account of the inclination in the case of Vaidhi Bhakti arises only by means of the rulings of Shastra, being stated earlier, only conviction in the meaning of Shastra is understood to be the original cause of Vaidhi Bhakti. Thus the word Shraddha is employed in this regard, that is, in regard to the meaning of Shastra. So, for context here, this statement in the Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu comes in the early portion of the chapter about sadhana bhakti, just after the definition of sadhana bhakti is given, and then the definition of Vaidhi Bhakti is given, or specifically Vaidhi Bhakti sadhana. So, what is Uttama Bhakti? That is discussed. What is one of its three forms, in other words, the sadhana form of Uttama Bhakti? That is explained. Then the two subdivisions of Uttama Bhakti, Raganuga Bhakti, Vaidhi Bhakti, the first of those, Vaidhi Bhakti, is defined. So it's defined, and that will come later on in this chapter, so we haven't gone through that yet, but we will eventually, as bhakti which is motivated by the governance of Shastra, or the injunction of Shastra. So, who's eligible to follow that? The person who has conviction in the Shastra, because no one follows the injunctions of things they don't believe in. Or in other words, if someone comes up to you that you don't respect and says, hey, you have to do this now, not only do you not do it, depending on how cultured you are, you might even respond to them in a less than polite way for ordering you to do something that you don't think you have to do. So, you don't follow the injunctions or the commands or the advice of things that you don't respect, of things that you don't hold to be of value. But you do follow the orders or the guidance of things that you do value. But you also only do so to a certain extent. In other words, somebody says, oh, I heard some new scientific research paper came out that says such and such medicine is just so great, or such and such new superfood is gonna, make you so healthy. So maybe you try it, maybe you don't, but you're not necessarily fully convinced. It's a new thing. Not many people know about it. There's not that much research about it. You're not necessarily going to have complete conviction in this, but you have enough regard to perhaps wish to try some new superfood. So you have not so firm, but enough Shraddha, so to speak, to act on it and actually eat the food, so to speak. But when it comes to things that you really have conviction in, and that you're not just thinking might possibly be beneficial, but you're 100% certain are beneficial, then you act on those things without any hesitation, without any doubt, and without any imprecision. So if one has conviction in Shastra, if one really has the conviction that what is enjoined here must be done, then what does someone do? That! In other words, they do the thing that the Shastra says, and they don't do things contrary to it. They're meticulously attentive to executing the order in full as it's intended. So, the extent to which one has conviction in Shastra is the extent to which Shastra can effectively motivate someone to perform the action that it enjoins. As we discussed at the beginning of the chapter, this is the chapter on the abhideya, which is, again, that which is to be stated by the Shastra, or the purpose of Shastra is to govern, is to direct human beings. So what does it do? It gives directions. It has things which need to be said, or an abhideya. So then what it has to say, in other words, is the videya, as it was glossed earlier, as the thing to be done. So the thing to be said is equivalent to the thing to be done. So when someone has conviction in the authority of the speaker who's speaking the thing to be done, then what does one do? That they do the thing to be done. So this is the logic and the whole frame of what's being discussed here, and why in the beginning of this comment he's referring back to the definition of Vaidhi Bhakti. So I'll just repeat it here now that the context is clear. On account of, quote, the inclination arises only by means of the ruling of Shastra. So the word is prabritti, so inclination, or you could just even take it as activity. What is it motivated by? That's what distinguishes Vaidhi Bhakti from Rag Bhakti, the motivation by which the action is performed. So why is the inclination or the action happening? In the case of Vaidhi Bhakti, it's happening because of the ruling of Shastra. So only conviction in the meaning of Shastra is understood to be the original cause. In other words, Vaidhi Bhakti is that which is motivated by the injunction of the Shastra. So the original cause of performing the act of Vaidhi Bhakti is the conviction one has in that Shastra. Because if one doesn't have the conviction, then the prabritti, or the action, the force to move, won't arise in the first place. So the word Shraddha is employed in this regard. In other words, Shraddha was defined as conviction in the meaning of Shastra. So, therefore, with it understood that Shraddha refers specifically to conviction in the meaning of Shastra, he describes a gradation among those possessed of Shraddha based on a gradation in their degree of Shraddha with 2 verses. Shastra. He speaks this in the following verse. So, the first point was that the person has... so how is it, or what is this conviction, so to speak, constituted of? So he says, expert, or nipuna, means proficient. Quote, firm resolve, dridhanishchoy, in all respects, sarvata, means with regard to deliberation upon the entity, that is, the supreme entity, the ultimate reality, deliberation on the means of attainment, sadhana, and deliberation upon the aim of an embodied being, the purushartha. So, what does Shastra talk about? As we've discussed in these chapters in the Sanatana Shiksha, as is laid out at the beginning of the Tattva Sandarbha, it principally speaks about the abhideya and the prayojana, and the vishoy, or the subject matter of the whole, that is the context in which the prayojana and the abhideya exist. So that vishoy is the paratattva, the ultimate reality. Then you have the sadhana and the purushartha synonymous with abhideya. So to have firm resolve means to have firm resolve in all of these respects, regarding what is the vishoy, the sambandha, if you will, regarding what is the abhideya, and regarding what is the prayojan. To have firm conviction on all 3 fronts, that will be required. Then, yukti, reasoning, furthermore, here is to be understood as only that which is adherent to Shastra. Because of the prohibition on the independence of reasoning, cited earlier in Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu 145, quote, pure reasoning, however, is certainly not an illuminator of the essential nature of bhakti because of its inconclusiveness. Because of the principle stated in the Vedanta Darshan, it is because of Shruti, that is, because of the statements in the Shruti Shastra, that Brahman is understood to not be subject to modification or limitation on account of testimonies, meaning Shabda Pramans, being the source of valid knowledge about Brahman. So I've given the translation there in the way Govind Baladeva Vibhushan contextualizes that statement in the Vedanta Sutra. The purpose of its citation here is this phrase Shabda Mulatvat, to say that Shabda or Shastra is the source of valid knowledge of Brahman. In other words, Brahman is that which the human intellect on its own cannot understand. So if at all it's possible for the human intellect to come to understand it, that source of knowledge has to come from beyond the faculty of only the human intellect. That faculty is called Shastra or Shabda. So the only way to know Brahman is this thing that comes from beyond or without. That is called Shabda, that is called Shruti, that is called Shastra. So Yukti alone and independent of Shastra is not what's referred to here. Rather, the authority of Shastra and the application of Yukti in conformity to the authority of Shastra, that is the type of Yukti discussed here. And 3, this is illustrated in the statement in the Vaishnava Tantra as follows. Quote, what is the intended meaning of a particular statement in conformity with the preceding and succeeding statements in the text where it originates? Reasoning such as this is the best form of deliberation. Dry reasoning, however, should be abandoned. So this is an important point. There's a distinction made between, quote, dry reasoning and proper reasoning. Sometimes what is called anukul tarka and kutarka. So to understand something according to its intended purpose within its context, that is called anukul tarka or anukul yukti, a favorable application of reasoning, the aim of which is to arrive at the, quote, tatparya, or the intended sense or the intention of what the author is trying to say. Books are not there for simply someone to just interpret however they like for whatever their purpose is. In the case of the Shastra, it has a message, it has a directive, it has a benefit it's trying to bring to its audience. So to read the text with the aim of acquiring that directive, acquiring that benefit as per the intent of the source of the text, not as per my liking, not as per what's fashionable of the present society, not as per what have you, but as per its tatparya, that will be to approach it in a manner that is, quote, anukul, or favorable. But to approach it otherwise is considered, quote unquote, dry, or as it was referred to in the first passage, as independent. So if one is reasoning independently or dryly, there's no end to such reasoning. One can go on and argue unlimitedly. Rupa Gosvami also cites in that same section a point which says that no matter how well you argue, soon enough, somewhere in the future, someone will come along with some refutation of your argument. Later on, someone will refute that. And here we are today in eternity, in the middle of samsara. People still arguing and will never, reach an end. Because it's not ultimately possible to determine anything with reasoning alone, which is the point made in the first passage here, quote, apartishtata. There's no ultimate conclusiveness or no ultimate establishment of reality merely by the application of yukti. So the whole name of the game here is Shraddha in the authority of the Shastra, and then application of the human faculty of the intellect to arrive at the tatparya, or the intent of the Shastra, which also has a methodology, let's call it hermeneutics, and without knowing that methodology, one will also not be successful. So part of, quote-unquote, yukti here is not just the idea that I'll use my intellect, but rather also learning how to do so, or training oneself to do so, in a manner that the Shastra or that the tradition has also presented. So someone who learns these processes, they are an advanced bearer of eligibility. Because we can say that no matter how much conviction you have in the Shastra, if you also misunderstand it and misapply it, you're not going to be successful. So good on you if you're gung-ho to follow what the Shastra says, but you also need to learn how to understand what the Shastra says, how to arrive at the intended directive of the Shastra, And then that conviction that you have will be efficiently leveraged into doing what the Shastra has directed you to, and thus to achieving the benefit that the Shastra wants for you. So you need both the strength to hold on to what the directive is, and the discernment to acquire a clear understanding of what that directive is. So you need to identify it and adhere to it. These are the two sides, or the two aspects. So the person who has expertise or advanced capability in these three respects is described here as a person with intense shraddha. So, firm conviction and expertise in both the Shastra and in reasoning. In other words, you have to know the texts, what they say. Especially in the old days, these things were memorized. So, capability to understand the language, capability to retain the content, and then capability to extract the meaning. There's a statement in the Charaka Samhita? One of the early Ayurvedic Shastras, which describes a certain section of Brahmanas as bharavahis, or load bearers, with the idea being that they labor to memorize texts, but they never learn the grammar and the hermeneutics in order to grasp the meaning of the text. So they're compared to load-bearing donkeys. It's a little bit of a strong remark. No intent to demean any brahmanas here, but it's more of a jolt to try to inspire people to learn more by saying a donkey can carry a heavy load of lumber or a heavy load of anything for a long distance, but they don't get the benefit of those goods. Let's say they carry a big load of perfume that's all kept in bottles. The load arrives at its destination, the beast of burden is taken off to carry another load, and it never gets to smell one whiff of that lovely perfume. So they're merely a load bearer. So similarly, persons who memorize Shastra, persons who repeat Shastra, traditionally Brahmanas would memorize by rote and keep texts alive and passed on by generations through rote recitation, which was a very sophisticated process and a difficult process. So it was a laborious process, which is being compared here to, the bearer of a load like a beast of burden. So as a beast of burden doesn't get to smell the perfume, the person who only learns how to memorize the text but doesn't learn the meaning of the text, they just, end up with no sweetness or, no fine fragrance or no richness in life. So therefore, the necessity of yukti, the necessity of expertise in ascertaining the meaning of the Shastra is also required. And, the vice versa element is there. There's scholars out there that are very adept in grammar, who are very, very intelligent people, who can read all of these texts and draw out so many, fine points in them. And then, head off to the bar and go chat about the weather and not follow any of it. So there's also no guarantee that even if you grasp what it means, that you'll necessarily even follow what it says. So therefore, drida nishchoy sarvata. Therefore, that element is also there. One has to have the ability to ascertain the meaning and the character or the capacity to adhere to the meaning. These two combined, that is the person who's eligible in the greatest extent for this path. So, I hope that's clear, but it'll become more clear when we look at the subgradation and how this idea of reasoning, how this idea of conviction is graded out. So let's come to the next payar. Shastra yukti nahi jane dridda shradhavan madhyamari karise maha bhagyavan. There's a mistake. One possessed of firm shraddha, who does not know Shastra and reasoning expertly, is an intermediate bearer of eligibility and greatly fortunate. So, which of the two is being given weight here? Someone has firm shraddha, but they don't know Shastra. The payar here is a bit blunt. It just says they don't know Shastra and reasoning, but as we'll see from Jiva Goswami's commentary, it's not that they don't know it at all, rather it's just that they don't know it fully well. So that person is intermediate. So the way that this is given in the Sindhu is as follows: Yashastradish anipuna shradhavan satu madhyama. One who is less expert in Shastra and so forth, that is, and reasoning yukti, but possessed of Shraddha, is rather an intermediate bearer of eligibility. So a fine point here is the way Jiva interprets the word anipuna. Because this negative prefix in Sanskrit a, just like we have in English amoral or atypical, has 6 different meanings that it can convey. The most common of which is a standard negation. So to say that someone is nipuna, expert, and then to say that someone else is anipuna, we would take it to mean not expert. So Jiva Goswami, however, doesn't opt for the standard flat opposite or the standard negation that this prefix can apply. Rather, he takes one of the other types of meaning that this prefix conveys as follows. So he takes it as, quote, less expert, anipuna, that is, like an expert, i.e., one who is not at the level of an expert, but nonetheless close to the level of an expert. So, nipuna sadrisha. So, one of the meanings of this Nyan sama, or Nyan pratyay, which in other words, this negative prefix, is sadrishyata, or similarity to something. So he takes it in that specific sense, that it's not saying the person has no expertise at all, rather they are expert. They're like expert. Means they're not quite fully expert, but they definitely have significant knowledge. So he puts it like this. Less expert, that is like an expert, meaning when a powerful objection is put forth, one is unable to resolve it. But one is able to resolve all other objections, save for those that are powerful. Still, one is possessed of Shraddha, meaning one certainly is a firm conviction in mind. In other words, the person can refute most objections, but perhaps just not the most severe, or the most difficult. Chakravarti Pad adds, quote, less expert, anipuna, means when a powerful objection is put forth, one is unable to resolve it. Still, one is possessed of Shraddha, meaning one certainly is of firm conviction in mind in regard to the essential nature of Bhagavan and so forth, taught by the Guru. So one has acquired significant knowledge, one has great conviction in that, and occasionally, or should it so arise that some very perplexing argument is put forth, then they may not be able to resolve that entirely. But nevertheless, this doesn't unsettle them. So the implication is that the Uttamadhikari is someone who can refute any and all objections or other considerations. Now we come to the third level. Jahara komala shraddha se kanishta jan, krame krame teho bhakta hoibe uttam. One who has soft shraddha is a neophyte person. Gradually, one will become an advanced bhakta. So shraddha was defined as being very firm, but the person who's a beginner, their shraddha is here called soft. In other words, not firm. So yo bhavet komala shraddha sa kanishtu nigadyate. One who may be of soft shraddha is called a neophyte. So Jiva Goswami has this to say about that. Here, also in this verse, quote, less expert in Shastra and so forth is to be supplied because of Shraddha itself being by nature conviction in the meaning of Shastra. Thus also here, less expert means somewhat expert. Soft Shraddha means able to be broken by other forms of reasoning and other statements from Shastra. So, what he means to say is that it's not that the Kanishta Adhikari has saf shraddha and no knowledge of Shastra and no knowledge of reasoning. Rather, they have some knowledge, they have some capability of reasoning, and they have some degree of conviction. So he doesn't want that the definition is read as limited to what is said there, but read as an elliptical statement based upon the previous definitions of the earlier adhikaris. Chakravarti Pad puts it like this. Soft shraddha, komala shraddha, means able to be broken by other forms of reasoning and other statements from Shastra, but not rather completely broken because of the non-establishment of someone's being a bhakta in such a condition. In other words, if someone's shraddha can be broken completely by a presentation of antithetical reasoning and statements from Shastra, then such a person cannot be considered a bhakta at all, and therefore would not be the intended object of this definition of a neophyte bearer of eligibility on the path of bhakti. I think I need a bracket there. In other words, if this person is being called an adhikari, then they have to have some shraddha, they have to have some knowledge. So when Jiva Gosvami says that their reasoning can be broken, then Chakravarti Pad is adding to that, but not completely broken, because if it could be completely broken, then they wouldn't actually have conviction at all. So the implication is it can be broken, but not entirely, or it can be shaken, or it can force them to go back and reflect and pray or what have you. But, in time, the person will rebound, the person will, refine, the person will learn such that their conviction ultimately deepens. The mention of, quote, softness in regard to Shraddha in the verse under discussion refers only to the mind's wavering only for a moment when a powerful objection is made by someone who is oblivious of Bhagavan or a Bahirmukha. So in other words, someone whose views are antithetical to bhakti, if someone hears some objection, some argument posed by such a person, then for a moment the mind may waver. For some time, for a short period, the person may feel the presence of doubt or concern or unclarity or what have you. But that then they respond to that. They persevere through that. They're not spun off, so to speak. They just waver temporarily, if indeed they have Shraddha. If they don't have Shraddha, then they'll not be they'll be gone off in another direction as a result of such a statement, in other words. Therefore, one, that is, a neophyte bearer of eligibility, ascertains clearly the meaning taught by the Guru by means of discernment accomplished by oneself. In other words, if someone hears some objection, then what do they have to do? If they find it disturbing, they have to contemplate. They have to discern what they've heard from their Guru, what they've read in the Shastra, and then on that basis they have to refine their understanding. They have to adjust something such that they understand why the objection that they heard was ultimately unfounded and why the path of bhakti is the apt path for them to pursue. Sri Chakravarti Pad also explains later in his commentary on Bhakti Rasamrita Sindhu that, quote, softness in Shraddha refers to being possessed of an absence of firm conviction that everything will come just by bhakti to Bhagavan. This comment further underscores why Shraddha was defined earlier here in the previous class as, quote, conviction, completely firm resolve that when one performs Krishna bhakti, all karmas are performed, and how a relative degree of firmness of resolve with respect to this principle, along with the relative degree of one's knowledge of the statements in the Shastra and the reasoning pervading them regarding this principle, is what determines the relative degree of one's eligibility for the path of bhakti. Okay, so I'm going to pause here. This is how the verses here in the Sindhu in the Caritamrta from the Sindhu are commented on, and how the Prakaran, unfolds. But I'm going to present here also a condensed discussion of many additional points regarding Shraddha that Jiva Gosvami brought out in the Bhakti Sandarbha, which are similar criterions for understanding the relative degree of Shraddha that a person has. In other words, this whole discussion is orbiting around the idea that by serving Bhagavan, all of one's duties are fulfilled, one need not adhere to the responsibilities that one has on the karma marg. This is the whole thread of all of this discussion, and that conviction is to be acquired by having understanding of the Shastra and how it describes and deals with these subject matters, such as the verse in the Bhagavatam that we discussed in the last class, where it explains that by worshipping Achyuta, all the devatas are satisfied, and therefore one need not perform these other yagyas and other things on the karma marg to satisfy them. But in addition to this idea that by doing bhakti to Bhagavan everything is done, there are also other important principles or other important fundamentals in which Shraddha needs to be present. And that's what Jiva Gosvami very valuably discusses in the Sandarbhas, specifically the Bhakti Sandarbha. So many who studied that recently are acquainted with that, so this can be a little vitamin packet condensed review of that content. But I'll pause here before I jump into that. If anyone has any comment, question, or anything on this core content that we've covered so far, I'll invite that. All right, very good. Then I'll proceed. So, Sri Jivapad also presents 9 means by which the relative firmness of someone's Shraddha can be further assessed in Bhakti Sandarbha, Anucheda 173. So he says, how is the presence of Shraddha itself known? This is to be considered. Previously, taking shelter in Bhagavan, or Sharanagati, was specified as an indicator or linga thereof. I think I need a bracket here. And the indicators of taking shelter in him are resolved for the favorable, and so forth, which will be discussed ahead. So, this is a very, very important point. He's saying the word linga, or indicator. So what is an indicator of Shraddha? Sharanagati. What is Sharanagati? It's made up of 6 limbs, the first of which is resolved to engage in that which is favorable. So I'm not going to go into an elaborate discussion of this here, because those 6 limbs of Sharanagati are discussed a little bit later in this chapter of the Caitanya-caritamrta. So we will discuss at length those 6 limbs with commentary from Jiva Gosvami, Sanatana Gosvami, Visvanatha Cakravarti, and Bhavartha-dipika when we get to that. But for now, we can just bear in mind that those 6 limbs are how the concept of taking shelter in Bhagavan, or Sharanagati, is understood. So, taking shelter of Bhagavan is the indicator of Shraddha. In other words, what is Shraddha? The conviction that by worshipping Bhagavan everything is done. So if you have that conviction, what do? Then you act on it. You take shelter in Bhagavan and not in the karma marg. You take shelter in Bhagavan and not money and fame and things of the world. Then your life actually changes, and the source of security, the source of peace, the source of fulfillment, the source of focus, all these things in your life become Bhagavan and not anything else. So, to the extent that one has Shraddha, there will be commensurate Sharanagati. One will not take shelter in anything that they don't believe in, just like we don't surrender ourselves to people we don't trust. We don't, in the modern day, we don't give out the passwords to our online accounts to people we don't know. We don't leave our car unlocked in the middle of a city. We don't do the things where you can't trust the people around you. But if you're, lucky enough to be a person who has trustworthy people in their life, then you also may sometimes share your property or your possessions or things that are valuable with them because you trust them. So you only take shelter in, or you only take the support of others when you have trust in them. Similarly, you'll only really take shelter in Bhagavan when you actually trust him, when you actually have faith in him, that he will protect you, that by serving him, everything will be fulfilled, everything required will be supplied, etc. It is only by having conviction in that one can actually become a Sharanagata. And as Jiva Gosvami famously says in the Bhakti Sandarbha, Tam bina tadiyatva siddhe, that without that, in other words, without Sharanagati, one can never become his own. In other words, you cannot be a bhakta if you're not first of all a Sharanagata. So this is the dominoes. You can't be a bhakta if you're not a Sharanagata. You can't be a Sharanagata if you don't have Shraddha. And the value of your Shraddha is based on the depth of your understanding of who is Bhagavan, of what is bhakti, of what is this thing that you're supposedly taking shelter in and trusting and serving. Therefore, Shravana, therefore hearing all of these things from the mouth of Guru and Sadhus and studying them in the Shastra is the edifice of the entirety of the path of bhakti. It's not just a bunch of rituals, it's not just a culture with nice music and nice food and nice art and these other things. The extent to which it will be a spiritual experience is predicated upon the depth of one's understanding and conception of it. The value with which anyone can do it is dependent on the understanding that one has. The understanding comes from the Shastra and from the application of the appropriate hermeneutics to arrive at the intended meaning of Shastra. This takes work. This is a pearl of great price. These are things that come, they're only actually for very cultured, very fortunate people. Therefore, as it was said earlier, ati bhagyena, the person who gets that kind of samskar by the association of a Mahatma, that is the fortunate person in this samsar, nobody else. So that person who gets that sangha, to get that samskar, to have this kind of shraddha, can do that kind of sharanagati and thereby become an actual bhakta. This is the way, there is no other way for these things to be genuine, rich, meaningful, and as fulfilling as they're purported to be throughout all the, quote, Mahatmya Katha, or all the praise of these things that we hear about throughout the Bhagavad, the Puranas, and elsewhere. Okay, pardon me for a little excessive elaboration, but I just want this one to really stick. If there's one of these 9 criterions by which the firmness of Shraddha is to be remembered, remember this one. By that I mean, don't forget it. In other words, if you have Shraddha, the proof of that is Sharanagati. This principle is very important. Okay, moving on. Number 2. So also, the absence of poor spiritedness and so forth, that is, parsimony, fear, anxiety, stress, dejection, depression, etc., in the midst of worldly affairs, is also to be known as an indicator of Shraddha. The Shastra verily produces such Shraddha, such as in the statement of the Gita by Bhagavan himself, where he promises his bhakta, I personally provide for the acquisition and protection of the necessities of those one-pointed, meditative, and ever-absorbed persons who worship me in full. Bhagavan himself is vowing to his bhakta that whatever you need, you will get. So if someone has conviction of that, then someone will trust Bhagavan to provide that, and therefore someone will not feel worried, someone will not feel afraid, someone will not feel depressed, someone will not feel anxious, someone will not be in down spirits, because they have confidence that Bhagavan is there, Bhagavan is looking after them, Bhagavan will provide what is required. And that, often, there's stories about how Bhagavan comes and gives food to, poor Vaishnavas. That's one truth, or that's one side of things, that he may provide literal, necessities in the form of room and board and so on. But it's not limited to that. In other words, he'll also provide the knowledge you require to come to him. Dadami buddhiyogam tam yenamam upayanti te. I supply that understanding by which you can come to me. So he also supplies knowledge. He also supplies, understanding of how to deal with difficult circumstances, understanding of how to process difficult emotions, blah, 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 blah. All the psychological challenges that people follow. A bhakta will also see that it is Bhagavan who is gracing one with the support required to persevere through all of those things. So when one holds on to, when one has that fundamental conviction in the guardianship of Bhagavan, then they will not become depressed, anxious, disturbed, fearful, etc. to an extreme or a debilitating extent. Does that mean at a given moment for 2 seconds, does that mean that people will never experience these emotions? Definitely not. They will. But the margin will be markedly less, and the difficulty will be markedly reduced to the extent that one has this type of Shraddha. So, Shraddha is the cure-all, so to speak, for psychological ailments, when it's based on accurate Shastric knowledge. So, when one takes shelter in Bhagavan and therefore has conviction in Bhagavan's protection, one need not become, dejected or whatever in whatever situation one is in. This is also a symptom of the strength of one's Shraddha, that one will become resilient, one will become strong in the midst of the world of uncertainty and suffering and death that's called earth, this plane of existence that we're in. Even though we live in a plane of, it's called here in the Shastra, Martya Lok, the plane of death. It's like, where do you live? I'm from the plane of death. And what happens there? Stuff that I can never predict every day. That's where I live. I live in the land of death, where I may die at any time, and anything can happen that's beyond my control, and I'm one tiny entity in this massive animation, and I can't control or protect myself from practically anything. Okay, and how is it like down there? How do you deal with all that? It must be miserable. Nope, I'm fine. You're fine. How are you fine? Because I have faith in Bhagavan. Nothing else, there's no amount of knowledge, no amount of culture, no amount of money, no amount of, mindfulness or deep breathing techniques or new age calming methods and, whatever. None of that will ever completely solve your problems. The only thing that can give you a sense of completely resilient, firm basis for peace, confidence, and hope in the midst of the innumerable potential disturbing elements of the world, the only possible solution to that, the only way to feel peace in the midst of the land of death and uncertainty is Shraddha in Bhagavan. There is no other way. So, to the extent that one has that Shraddha, one will become free from all of these things that the vast majority of human society is suffering from, and then suffering from the failing measures that they take to try to alleviate those problems. As Prahlad Maharaj says, the solutions, the attempts to remove the suffering produce further forms of suffering. You're tired all day, you get home, so you get drunk. You get drunk to remove your pain, then you're drunk, then you treat your friends bad, then they hurt you, then they steal from you, then everything you do to try to remove your problems just creates more problems. So the only thing that can actually end this chain is to not try to rely on any of these inadequate, faulty means of relieving the problems, but only to have Shraddha in Bhagavan, he who is all capable of solving all things. Okay, sorry if I sound like I'm doing a Bhakta pep talk here. I'm not trying to, just rally off randomly. But these are very, very fundamental things, and they are hearty things. They're worthy of a little bit of spirited discussion. At least from time to time, why not? So, yes, we need knowledge, yes, we need hermeneutics, yes, we need, to understand all these principles, but these things ultimately are extremely practical, right? All this talk we're doing here, it might seem very, analytical or whatever, but if one actually goes through this process accurately and catches the wave, so to speak, enters into the spirit of what's being described here, this is, not just the fruit, this is just the low-hanging fruit. This is very simple low-hanging fruit that comes from all of this. Krishna Prem, Madhurya Svada, and all these higher things, oh my, this is far more fantastic than we can even conceive now. But even just a little bit of Shraddha in the basis of this, that itself, this path is such a thing that even a little bit of just the eligibility to follow this path can alleviate all the problems that nothing else can ever solve. This is the path that our Goswamis have laid out here from the Bhagavad, and what Bhagavan himself is promising in the Gita in these verses we discussed. Okay. So that was point number 2. And, point number 3 is long, so I better leave that out. So I'll pause here for today. So just a brief recap, we've covered a relative gradation in the firmness of Shraddha, which is based on the level of expertise that one has in Shastra, which was qualified as the ability to respond in the midst of challenges. In other words, that you just live in an echo chamber of a whole bunch of other people with a simplistic understanding and never talk to or communicate with anyone who thinks differently. That's not the idea, that is not satsanga. Right? The idea here is to acquire a resilient understanding of the purport of all of the Shastras such that whatever can be said from left, right, and center of like-minded and unlike-minded, what have you, it won't shake you. If we only practice bhakti in some, sheltered environment, we never get exposed to sufficient, obstacles or sufficient antithetical challenges, then we never actually become strong. We never actually acquire firm Shraddha because we never actually encounter any significant, what you call purva pakshas or prima facie views of other things. So a certain amount of this is also necessary in order for someone's conviction to become deep-rooted. And when one acquires that resilience, then we can say really they are proceeding on the path. So they need to have gone through this type of analytical study to some extent. You don't have to become a big scholar and all of that, but some fundamental exercise in all this is important. And on the basis of that, to have such conviction in the words of Bhagavan and in service to Bhagavan that one takes shelter in him, to such an extent that one is not afraid and one is not despairing, even in the midst of immediate worldly austerity. This much we've covered so far about firmness in Shraddha. So, I see a hand. Yes, looks like Brajananda. Please.
Yes, Babaji, pranam, accept my pranam. So, I would like to illustrate an objection of the absolute Sharanagati we should get with the examples of the wives of the German soldiers during the war, and they were praying God for the return of their husbands.
Okay.
So finally, many of them they didn't return, and the wives they finally lose their faith.
Okay.
So because the intensity of their desire was so strong, they were asking to God, like kind of Sharanagati, we can get ourselves also. So now, I would like to know what is the situation when actually the desire is so strong and it's not fulfilled by the grace of the Lord, and finally ending in the loss of the faith.
Okay. Well, I'll try to address that if I've understood what you want to discuss accurately or not. So, people may approach God or Bhagavan with some idea of what is required for them. some idea of how they will be protected. That idea may be accurate, it may not be. Maybe the best thing for them might not be. So a bhakta will see that what Bhagavan provides, that's best. Bhagavan is not an erring or unknowing entity. So how he wants to protect me, that will be best. It will be better than my idea of how I'll be protected. It will be his idea of what is in my best interest, not necessarily my own. Just as you talk to kids, they'll express their grievances. My parents don't understand what's good for me. They make me go to school, they make me eat vegetables, they make me go to bed early. This is miserable. They don't know anything about how I feel and how I can be happy. A kid doesn't know what's good for them. So the parents have to give them what's good for them, even if they don't like it, even if they don't understand it for a certain time. Similarly, many times in this karmic journey called samsara, we become attached to 1 in a million worldly things and think that we can't live without them, think that there's no happiness in life, think that there's nothing without them. And 1,000 times Bhagavan has to break those attachments. And so his protection, his benefit for people is not necessarily the thing that they wanted. It's not necessarily the thing that they like. So if some person says, oh, I want this and you didn't give it to me, therefore I don't have faith in you, that's their fault. In other words, they're not open, they're not able to necessarily accept what's actually in their own best interest. Now, I'm not trying to be unsympathetic to the wife of a woman who loses her husband in the war or goes through tragic circumstances. There are no shortage of tragic circumstances, whether it's World War II or the bombs going off today in various places. There's people going through that same type of abject, miserable challenge right now as we speak. So this is not a new thing, it's not an old thing. As far as I'm concerned, you'll see it again 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, the same type of stuff you're still going to see. So the world is full of these things. And Bhagavan is the ruler of this world. So if they weren't part of what is ultimately in the best interest of these people, they wouldn't exist. This is a premise, right? Jiva Gosvami, he says, if Bhagavan felt compassion for all the difficulties that these worldly entities come, he would evaporate all worldly suffering in one instant. But he doesn't have the same perspective that a conditioned soul has. He's not moved to do that the way a conditioned soul might like him to be. So to have faith in him, to trust in him, to rely on him, is not just to petition him for what we want or what we estimate to be of value, but to trust in what he provides, and moreover, to also learn how to be happy without necessarily depending on anything. Why can't we be happy just chanting his name? Why can't we be happy just meditating on his form? Why can't we be happy just thinking of him? And accept wherever he wants to cast us in the world, in whatever circumstances it may be, and consider that, that's his grace, that's the way, the unfolding of my karma, and it's an opportunity for me to enrich and intensify my efforts in observing the path of bhakti. So the perspective of a bhakta will be different than the perspective of a common person who conceives of well-being in the context of, wealth and health and, the pleasures of the body and conventional sources of peace of mind. Does that hit on where you wanted to go with this?
Yes, just only it's about the ending. What if it's a result? If the result ends in the loss of the faith? This is the most important point of my question.
Okay, you mean somebody prayed to God for whatever they wanted, they didn't get it, and then they lost faith in who they thought God was. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, and particularly in such extreme case, because to have a husband for a woman is such an important thing in her life.
Sure. So for a person to have faith only in someone who gives them what they want and adheres to their view of how they have to be, That's not even a good strategy to have in a worldly relationship. What to speak of a relationship with God? If you put some condition on him and say, unless you give me this thing that I think you're supposed to give me, I'm not going to accept that you exist. And then, maybe it's better for that conception to break. In other words,
yes.
rather than perpetuating this superficial idea, why not just crush it? And say, I'm never going to be that person you wish I was. I'm never just going to sit here as your order supplier and say, yes, carry on with whatever you would like in your state of illusion, and I'll just supply all of that, and you can, give thanks to me on some, scheduled, loop of rituals. Like, this is what a lot of conventional religion is. But from, we might say a Bhagavatam perspective or a Vaishnava perspective, where we like it a little thicker, so to speak. The idea of having a relationship with Bhagavan, the idea of worshipping Bhagavan is a little deeper than that. So it may be also perceived that Bhagavan can not live up to those type of superficial ideas of who he is for people in a manner that might actually lead them to confronting or dealing with the acute difficulties of their life and thinking in a new way about him, thinking in a new way about how their relationship could be.
Yes, Babaji. Okay. Thank you.
But, Chakravarti Pad in his Tika on the Tate Nukampam Susamikshramano verse, he compares Bhagavan to a father. I mean, if we borrow, we're skimming on the edge of a bit of Christian discussion here. So, he refers to a prayer of Prithu Maharaj, where Prithu Maharaj says, Prabhu, like a father looks after his son, please look after me. In other words, the person who really knows what's best for me, I'll just trust that what you do is best, and I'll accept that. And so he says, a father sometimes smells the head of his son and pats him affectionately, feeds him, sweet milk, but sometimes also slaps his son and feeds him neem juice. So if he needs discipline, he gets a slap. If he needs medicine, he gets neem juice. If he needs affection, he gets, a rub on the head and a whiff on the head is an Indian gesture of affection. So whatever's required in the circumstance, that's what's supplied. Just as a parent, the same love that they have for the child can come out in completely opposite apparent ways. Sometimes the affection comes out as harsh discipline. Sometimes it comes out as tender affection. Sometimes it comes out as cookies for dessert. Sometimes it comes out as bitter medicine. It comes out in all these ways, but it's the universality to it, or the singularity of it, is that it's all an expression of love for the well-being of the child. So the person who has faith in Bhagavan will see that what Bhagavan arranges for one's life, that's in my interest. That's Bhagavan's grace. So this is how Jiva Gosvami interprets this verse in Bhakti Sandarbha, that the reactions to my actions, this thing called karma, whatever karma I get, that's Bhagavan's grace. In other words, it's not Bhagavan's job to come and relieve me from my karma. That Bhagavan administered to me my karma, that's his grace. I'm ready to accept Bhagavan's grace, my own karma as a form of Bhagavan's grace. I'm ready to see it like that. And so the person who can do that, right, Jivaiteyo mukti pode sadaya bhak, that person is in line for liberation, or in other words, that person is approaching transcendence of this whole plane of samsara. Whereas people who are still doing the petitioning list and still calculating according to all these limited relative narratives, they're stuck in the mud. Anyway, I don't mean to elaborate too much on the point, but perhaps that adds a point or two. I recommend the commentaries on the verse Tate Nukampam Susamikshramano on that topic. So, I think I'll leave it at that for today, and next time we'll look at the additional characteristics by which we have grounds for contemplation, grounds for introspection, about the nature of Shraddha, about the firmness or the depth of Shraddha, and where we may find room for growth, opportunity for further resilience and strength of heart as we aspire to follow this path. Vaishnavebhyo Namo Nama. Jai Shri Guru, Jai Shri Gaur, Jai Jai Shri Shri Radhe Shyam.
Radhe Shyam. Thank you so much.